Hello there, Seaside Shadows. This is your ghost hostess Laura here, and we are doing a very special segment of Spooky Story Sunday here. Now, some of you may have seen that we posted a mysterious photo on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Some of you have correctly guessed the identity of this mysterious figure. It is none other than Connecticut's very own Leatherman. Now, we can first start our story off talking about the mysterious origins of this Leatherman. Now, of course, you may think perhaps he was a Connecticut resident, and that's when he began his mysterious journey. No one really knows for sure, though I may give you some insight in a moment. Now, our story begins in 1856. Tramps, as they were called, were not that unusual on the roads in Connecticut. Oftentimes you would be wandering along and you'd see someone looking a bit disheveled, and they were called a tramp. They were someone who would going from door to door asking for jobs or asking for money. But this mysterious figure was not a tramp at all. When he was first spotted in 1856, he was wandering down the road, and it was described that you could hear the creaking of his leather outfit. They saw a strange man lumbering down the road, head to toe in leather. With the creak of the leather and the soft plodding sound of his shoes. He was a mysterious figure indeed to these Connecticut residents. We are talking about the time right before the Civil War, when things were tumultuous. But this man did not come for any turmoil. He was not even dangerous, for he just seemed to wander these roads. And after a while, people began to notice. This mysterious man was wandering the same roads over and over. They also began to observe more about him, such as being head to toe in leather was quite heavy. And they eventually did find out that his leather outfit weighed 60 pounds. So it's clear this was a man of strength. So where exactly did he come from? Well, that was quite a mystery for these Connecticut residents. In fact, we do have a few contemporary news reports that I am going to read to you today. The first one comes from 1869. Now you have to remember that's quite a long time after 1856. Why did they wait so long? They needed to find out more about this man. And how can you find out more about a man that barely speaks? For this is another mysterious aspect of the Leatherman. Besides his strange plodding throughout these towns and his creaking leather outfit, he barely spoke a word. Now, of course, this gave rise to many legends. But this newspaper had a very different take. They began to speak to those residents who had seen him wandering, and they began to ask who this strange man was, and they took it upon themselves to do some investigative reporting. This is from the Portchester Journal, Thursday, August 26th, 1869, in North Greenwich. It says simply, "The Old Leatherman." A Frenchman, aged about 35 years, dressed entirely in leather, stripped from old bootlegs, and who carries a leather pack on his back and a tin pail in his hand, continually travels around the country, coming from the same direction and passing through the fields at a certain point. Curiosity led me recently to follow this strange being, and I found he had a home under a shelving rock in the woods, where he has also a good well of water and a well-tilled garden, fenced in with bushes and poles and kept in good order. But his vegetables do not flourish satisfactorily, owing to the poor soil. We could but wish this poor creature success in his loneliness. That is quite a bleak image painted of Leatherman, but as you can see, this mysterious man was no tramp. He had his own gardens, and in fact there are reports that he built his own planters in these strange shelters where he lived. It also says that he found water, which is quite unusual, as many of his shelters were far away from any road or any man-made well. Now, in these observations from this reporter, we can also glean that not entirely is his outfit made of leather. In fact, his shoes were made of a spruce wood, and upon further inspection, it was discovered that it was a style similar to one in northern France. That does lend some truth to what the newspaper says, that he was a Frenchman. So we are starting to get a picture of this man. We also do hear that he did use a wooden staff occasionally, so he was helped out on his journey quite a bit. Now, as for his journey, we keep talking about his wanderings, but we do not realize the full extent of how long this was. This man walked 365 miles. His average? He did it in 34 days. That is over 10 miles a day. This man, wearing a 60-pound suit with a leather pack with heavy leather marking materials, would wander. And he would do this for over 30 years of his life. But, contrary to popular belief, this man did not just stay in Connecticut. No, part of his route did go to New York, and that was the same route he took for those 30 years. Connecticut, New York, Connecticut, New York. We will be sharing a map on our page later to show you his route, and perhaps show you some of the very shelters that Leatherman used. But if you wish to truly follow his route, that would be impossible, for it appears that he did travel to the Berkshires. There were interviews with many a people who claimed to see Leatherman in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. It is unknown why he would travel to this place, but what is even more curious is the fact that he was sighted as far away as Canada. Well, if you think about what those newspapers reported, that he may in fact be a Frenchman, could it be that he was in fact French-Canadian, and he had some connection to Canada that he would return to? But then why would he return to Connecticut? There is some contemporary reporting of his absence. For instance, in 1877, it says, "Sometimes he comes along at intervals of a couple of weeks, and then again will be absent for weeks and occasionally months." Where did he go? Another one, in 1881. The Leatherman, a peculiar figure that has traveled up and down the Newtown Turnpike for years, has again made his appearance on that thoroughfare after an absence of several months. The Leatherman does disappear on occasion, and we do have these sightings in Massachusetts and Canada. Perhaps he did have another route going all the way up there. Is he visiting family? Does he have a trade up there? We will never know. What we do know is what we can glean from those accounts of those that met him. It is speculated he was born in the 1830s, possibly in Canada, possibly as a French-Canadian. Now, we do know some physical information about him, as he did take off his cap every now and again, and also, sadly, we do have reports from his autopsy. He was 5'7" and weighed between 140 to 170 pounds. This seems to have depended on the weather. As you can imagine, this man traveled through blizzards in New England. But he was a survivalist, for when his eventual body was discovered, there was not a touch of frostbite on him. Why was this man so untouched by frost? Why was he able to survive these harsh New England winters? One theory comes to mind. It is known that many French Canadians intermarried with the indigenous people in Canada. In fact, there is a name for them, the Métis. The Métis are the descendants of those French Canadians and of the natives. Is it possible that the Leatherman was himself Métis? That is why he was so well endowed with these survival skills. After all, he managed to find these shelters all on his own, and many did report they were far away from any civilization. We have a report from a paper that says that he was over half a mile from the road in his shelter, and they were stated to have said, how he ever found this spot so remote from any road is as much a mystery as himself. Something else that lends credence to this theory, he spoke, well, I should say spoke, he understood French and English. For I did say before, he did not seem to speak very much, though it was known that occasionally he would speak a word or two in French or English, and he did appear to understand when you spoke to him in either language. It is not known whether he spoke any indigenous languages, but again, how is it possible that he had these skills? How is it possible that he survived these winters? How did he find these shelters or this water? I think the theory that he was in fact Métis has some truth to it. Now, it was also known that he had many skills. Of course, we know he wore his leather outfit, but where did it come from? Many did observe that he made his own clothing himself. They observed that it was often made of discarded boot tops of leather, for it was still pliable. He would sew them together, and it was actually often remarked that he was rather good at this, which lends even more of a mystery to this Leatherman. If he had skills in a trade, why did he not use them and settle down? Or in fact, where did he learn this trade at all? Was it from a father? Was it from having an apprenticeship? We will never know. We also know that he was extremely skilled at preserving meat and growing vegetables in his garden. Despite the soil of Connecticut trying to get him down, he still did manage to make a living in these woods. We do have a comment from one of those who met him on his remarkable skills. This comes from Mrs. Woodruff. In Deep River, New Era, Saturday, January 20th, 1877. The old Leatherman passed through this place on Thursday, calling at Mrs. Woodruff's for food, which he ate, grunted his thanks, and went on his way rejoicing. He has a piercing black eye that denotes anything but a lack of intelligence, and his leather suit, made up of old bootlegs, shows considerable ingenuity, enough at least to earn him a livelihood if directed into the proper channel. This is very unusual that he had this skill, but he did not ever use it. In fact, when he called upon households, he would never use it to his advantage. In fact, he relied on the kindness of others to survive in addition to his wilderness survival skills. He was given along the way tobacco and cigarettes, as were his favorites. And it seems that society had a soft spot for this Leatherman, for besides giving him those gifts, they welcomed him with open arms into their towns. In 1879, there was a law passed called the Tramp Act. That act prevented any considered tramps to be arrested and imprisoned, never to be seen in the towns again. Well, these towns did not take too kindly to those attempting to take away their beloved Leatherman. In fact, these towns passed counter ordinances to prevent anyone from arresting Leatherman. Of course, this did not apply to the other tramps, just to Leatherman, as he was a very special friend to many. For although he did not speak much, he had a certain kindness to him. Oftentimes, when it was known that the Leatherman would come to these towns, businesses and schools would shut down. The school children would come clamoring out to see the great Leatherman, and those who had the best grades would be the one to give him food or gifts. He would show up at people's doorsteps, and they would give him their freshly baked loaves of bread or any scraps of food they had. He seemed to be a bit of a jovial fellow as well, for when the children were seen trying to play with him as he was going on his journey, he would often watch them as they went by and smiled, and when they tried to give him gifts, leaving pennies along fence posts, he took them with glee, only to return moments later with newer, shinier pennies for these children, leaving them on the very fence post that he took them from. It did not seem that he hated company, it just seemed that he liked his space. Now, of course, there are other observations of the Leatherman from these newspapers, as he was such an important figure in these towns. In fact, it was such an important day when he came. They proclaimed those days Leatherman Day, and they reported it in the paper. we have something from Goshen saying, "This odd-looking mortal was around again last week." That was in 1878. In 1877, in Deep River, the old Leatherman passed through this place on Thursday. Another in Essex. The old veteran Leatherman passed through this place on Thursday last. And as usual, he stopped at the house of W.B. Starkey on South Blood Street and partook of hot coffee, cake, and pie, as he had done for the past 20 years. He makes his trip every 6 weeks, he is always on time, and he never fails. Another, in Harwinton, says the Leatherman has begun his rounds again. He passed through the town last Monday. He looks quite natural, except for that coat of dirt on his face is a little thicker. So it seems he had many friends in these towns. He was a figure well known to everyone, and they do know his routine very well. 365 miles every 37 days. It was in fact observed what he was doing and when he was doing it by these papers, but also by his friends. It is not known if he considered these people in the town to be friends or not, but they considered him to be a friend, and one man in particular seemed to have befriended him, for he was also a leather worker, and he had some interesting observations about the Leatherman. He states, "For 30 years, more or less, at nearly regular intervals, a mysterious character known as the Leatherman, from his peculiar dress consisting of old bootlegs ingeniously fashioned together with leather strings, has passed through our town. Mr. Alexander Gordon, with a view of learning something of his history, has frequently entertained him, also giving him on various occasions leather strings and old newspapers. Mr. Gordon has offered him money, but he always refuses to take it. A short time ago he is passing through the town, called at Mr. Gordon's tannery, and he proposed to oil up his clothing, which had become very dry and hard from exposure to the weather. As the Leatherman offered no objections, Mr. Gordon commenced business, using up 2 quarts of oil in his operation." Now he did also mention that he did offer the Leatherman a place to stay for the night, but he refused. He was simply gracious that he had helped fix up his leather suit. Now this man, Mr. Gordon, did keep tabs on his friend the Leatherman, and in fact, every time he passed through town, he would mark it down on his calendar. So we have a report in 1880 that he passed through the town 10 times, or once in every 38 days. This can be attributed to the fact that there were a great many blizzards during that year. And again, in 1881, said the longest time between his visits was 38 days, the shortest was 31, and the average was 33. So it appears it did depend on the weather, on when the Leatherman was coming to these towns. Now, as I said, he had been doing this for a great number of years, over 30 to be estimated. But sadly, all good things must come to an end. Now this mysterious man began to fade. It is said that he had cancer on his lip, and as he began to deteriorate, people began to start to feel sorry for him. They asked if he would like a place to stay, which he denied. They asked if he would like to see a doctor, which he denied. But eventually, it became too much, and one of those towns that did protect him turned him over to the Connecticut Humane Society, which at that time did care for humans as well as animals. They arrested him with the intention of taking him in. This was on December 3rd in 1888. They took him inside, checked him over, found he had no frostbite, as I mentioned before. The only thing wrong with him was that cancer on his lip. But sadly, it appears that nothing could have been done for this Leatherman, for they did end up releasing him without treating him. Though it should be noted that moments before they released him, they did have a doctor examine him, see if perhaps there was a mental defect, as they would call it. But alas, the doctor found nothing, and in fact declared him to be perfectly sane, and could not think of any reason why he made this mysterious journey for so long. Now, of course, his journey did come to an end months later, on March 20th, 1889. He had been lying for 4 days before someone had found him. They were expecting him in the next town, but when he did not arrive, they became concerned. They knew of where his shelter was, and when they went to collect him, they saw that he was lying on the floor. They then brought him to the hospital, but it was too late. He had died around his 50s of blood poisoning from his cancer. Of course, the autopsy did reveal that information about him, how tall he was, how much he weighed, and in fact was able to weigh that leather suit, which is how we know it weighed 60 pounds. They found his leatherworking materials with him. They found a few pennies, but there was not much else. The community did feel very bad for Leatherman, and they took it upon themselves to have him buried in Ossington, New York. Now, he did lay in an unmarked grave, save for an iron pipe sticking out of the ground. Leatherman had many fanciful tales written about him after his death. Now, while he lay, almost forgotten, in that graveyard, people began to make strange tales that he was the scorned suitor of someone in France, or all sorts of things about how he came to be Leatherman. But alas, they were Victorian fanciful tales. And we still did not know the identity of the Leatherman until 2011, when archaeologist from University of Connecticut, Nick Bellantoni, decided that he would try to solve the mystery of the Leatherman. They got permission to dig up his grave in that cemetery called Sparta Cemetery. But something strange was occurring with the Leatherman, for it appears that as he was in life, he is also in death, and he does not wish you to know his identity. For when they dug up his grave, there was naught but a few nails from his coffin, not even a sliver of bone to be had of the Leatherman. This was very unusual, and while they looked far and wide around his gravesite, they could find no bones of the Leatherman. Resigned to that fate, the archaeologists took some of those nails and the dirt that was near his gravesite, reburied it in a more formidable site of the cemetery, where you can now see a large boulder on top of a hill with a plaque proclaiming the Leatherman. Now, we do have an interesting contemporary account that perhaps lends some light to the Leatherman's death and to the mystery behind him. For as disappointing as it was that we could not find the Leatherman, perhaps test him to see where he truly came from, it appears his contemporaries knew just as much as we do. For in the New Haven Daily Palladium in 1883, that is 6 years before his death, they did write, "I have noticed in your paper several communications concerning the mysterious Leatherman, whose strange and regular reappearance, as stated at various intervals, have occasioned so much comment and curiosity throughout the towns where he has become a familiar visitant. It has become ascertained that this eccentric person, whose character and manner of life are unusual and interesting enough to warrant their perception in the pages of romance, as we mentioned before, has for an abiding place a sort of hut built between the rocks about halfway between Madison and Clinton. It is somewhat back from the road, not far from the railway, and for many years has constituted the dearest spot on earth, home sweet home, to the strange silent wayfarer who has become a familiar sight along our highways. Here he lives when he is not journeying, which is presumably seldom, since, as your correspondence has informed you, his appearances are regular and unremitting. However, he has been found at home, sitting at the door of his hut or cave, occupied in mending some old tins. Within were to be seen evidences of his domestic arrangements, which were not characterized by any undue luxury. As usual, to all interrogations and attempts to draw him into conversation, he presented the same immovable front, which for years he has maintained against the curiosity of the world with which he comes in contact. Whatever his secret is, it will die and be buried with its owner." They continue on to remark about his interesting life, and what a sorrowful life it must have been, though we do know that he did have many friends in many towns. It does end on a rather sad note, saying, "Someday this incomprehensible character will fail to appear at his accustomed time, and somewhere on the weary roads, or in that solitary lonely hut, will doubtless be found the dead body of the queer old Leatherman, who from thenceforth will be to us but a tradition. Seems eerily prophetic that they wrote that 6 years before his death, but it is as true back then as it is today. We know no more about the Leatherman. If you do wish to visit him, or rather, the lack of him, you may go to New York to the Sparta Cemetery in Ossining. Now, perhaps some of you, our spooky viewers, wish to truly see the Leatherman, and for that we do have a treat for you. The Leatherman Trail, that 365-mile route he took, is a hiking trail to this day. In fact, you can hike the Leatherman's original route and see his original shelters, many of which are named after him. And it is said, in these shelters, you may perhaps get a glimpse of the Leatherman himself. We do have an account of a farmer on whose land one of these shelters was. After the Leatherman's death, this farmer decided to explore, for he had heard fanciful rumors that the Leatherman was secretly wealthy and had hidden a treasure in one of these shelters. He decided to go into one of his caverns with his torch lit. And as he ventures further into this cavern, he begins to feel an icy chill. This chill gets stronger and stronger until the wind blows his torch right out. And as he is fumbling around in the darkness, he sees a light. Someone has lit sticks and leaves on the floor, and as the flames grow higher, the figure who lit those sticks and leaves becomes visible. It is the Leatherman himself, sitting in his cavern as he once did those decades before. He rises up from his seated position, staring this man down who has dared to disturb his eternal rest. He raises his hand and he points furiously at the exit for this man to leave. Not one to be told twice, he did run out that cavern, never to re-enter again. So, our spooky fans, if you do wish to see this Leatherman, go ahead and look up those trails and those shelters. Perhaps you can see for yourself where he is. There have also been some discussions among our Seaside Shadows crew that we may perhaps investigate his trail ourselves and see once and for all if we can discover what the Leatherman is truly hiding. Thank you all for joining our Spooky Sunday story. We do these every Sunday at 8 o'clock. We have our Mystical Monday live Q&A tomorrow at 7:30. If you do wish to join us, you can send in some questions while we are live or comment below if you wish us to answer any questions. We will be discussing the Leatherman, Samuel Colt, and Rosemary Water from our previous segments. You are more than welcome to join us. Now, thank you for joining me on this very special segment.